Hey everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Into the Rift podcast, a Riftbound TCG podcast, hosted by myself, Alexander Coccia, and my good friend, Joe Curley. Joe, what an absolutely unbelievable weekend out in Houston. I got to tell you, anybody at all that doubted the esports potential of Riftbound has been proven fundamentally wrong, because what an absolutely unbelievable show out there in Houston. I gotta be honest with you, okay? First of all, if I had critical things to say, I would say them. I don't shy away from those things. The production was phenomenal. The casters were knowledgeable. They had charisma. They had the audience hooked right from the get-go. I have never been so invested in a TCG live event as I was in this given weekend. We had ups, we had downs, we had insane top eights, we had incredible matches with twists and turns all over the place. This was a TCG esports event done right. Joe, what did you think of Houston?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I've seen a lot of card games over the years come through and do productions, but as a very first production for Riftbound, certainly in English, it was unbelievable. It set the bar and the standards so high. I thought it was such a nice touch having game developers as part of the broadcast team, because you really can see their passion for the game, and their knowledge, of course, shines through. And of course, Annie was on an absolute tear. It was really the Annie show in the end, wasn't it?
Annie was absolutely incredible. And if anything, it's so funny looking at the individual card market prices after an event like this. You're seeing Annies and Flashes go through the roof in their value because of the display they put on here. Now, a lot of people went into this tournament kind of recognizing that Kaisa was going to be there, Master Yi was going to be there. We knew what the meta calls were, and we did have an expectation that, a couple of the aggro-oriented Annie shells could potentially overperform, but I'm not sure if many people had it as the winner on their bingo card, which just goes to show you how these types of TCG events can be won by anyone who comes in and not just plays a well-rounded designed deck list, but pilots them to tremendous success. I watched some of the best TCG gameplay I think I've ever seen this weekend, and kudos to all the players, not only that participated, went to Houston and got involved with Riftbound as a whole, but to those who made top cut and eventually made the show as phenomenal as it was in that top 16.
Yeah, it was so much fun to watch. And I think what was particularly exciting as a viewer is because the game is so new, there was a very interesting dynamic where we saw such amazing high quality gameplay. Like the skill ceiling in Riftbound is just so high. Big decision making, like this triple smoke screen play in a single turn from Alan really stands out in the top 8. But there was also some mistakes, right, on stage. People learning rules for the first time. Like on day 1, there was an Acarthian Rain targeting something with deflect, and they had to end up recycling 7 runes, and they were just hands in head. We saw people missing Arena's greatest triggers at huge moments. It was high level stuff, but also so much excitement, partly caused because of how new the game is. People are learning on the job, and it just made for such a unique event. And I definitely echo what you say, the production was fantastic, almost no downtime, having interviews of people in the hall. You've got big content creators from other games who are live on stream playing. It's just got all the makings really, and Riot really know how to start building those storylines, seeing Alan, a former Runeterra world champion, up there. They're actively mentioning Hearthstone, Magic the Gathering, Flesh and Blood on the stream. It's a very different approach, and Riot are already starting to sort of seed those stories that you need for competitive card games. So I think it was an absolutely brilliant event.
What I think you're seeing here is word of mouth just praising what Riftbound is and what it's been doing. I mean, for me, right, I have so many games I could be playing at any given time, right? I have so few hours in my day to commit to things, but all I do is think about Riftbound. I'm sorry, Marvel Snap fan. I go to bed, I think about Riftbound, I think about Blue Seals. I'm trying to make Blue Seal Teemo decks, and then I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I do is I text Joe with new deck ideas, and he's bouncing ideas off me, right? It is completely taken over my life. My whole mindset is just Riftbound. I see the world in colors now, where it's just oh, I bet you, red purple is going to do pretty good today. I think I'm going to build some Annie. I think I'm going to try some Jinx. I'm always trying to brew something, and this game has completely pulled me in, and I think it's doing it for other people as well. And we have competitors in Houston that had just learned the game within the week. Right. And, that was so funny about hearing about how, relatively new competitors were asking judges just for rules clarifications while they're competing on one of the biggest stages for Riftbound thus far. So I got to tell you, we are only at the beginning for Riftbound TCG. There is not a better time to get started because right now you're just seeing the groundwork for what is going to be an immensely successful TCG. And I'm Joe, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on a podcast, right? You and I have talked individually. You know that I'm excited about this. I know that you are beyond excited about Riftbound, right? I cannot wait to see what the future has in store for us. And Riot, you put on a great show at Houston. And today we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. We're going to talk about the tournament meta, what we saw, cards that stood out, kind of key takeaways from it. We're going to talk about the best of prizing, which I thought was absolutely phenomenal. The prizing as a whole was great. We're also going to do a top 8 breakdown, and we're going to talk about the top decks as well. Joe, you're going to lead the way talking about some of the things that you saw, the synergies in the deck building in general. So why don't we get started with the tournament meta and some of its key takeaways. Joe, I'm going to give you the floor here. We got Annie on the screen. Annie, obviously the big winner overall. But what are some of the things that you noticed throughout the course of this tournament that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I think obviously coming into this tournament, Kaisa, big heavy percentage of the meta, Master Yi, possibly playing Dazzling Aurora, the second biggest deck. Both those, when you think of Kaisa, traditionally you think of sort of a control style deck, it can play quite quickly. So really there's been a bit of a space in the meta with, of course, the Dazzling Aurora deck being very slow, to just have something that's very quick. And red and purple, you've got Annie and you've got Jinx, but as it's proven, the extra runes that you get in your opponent's turn for Annie just lends itself so nicely to an aggressive deck. Sneaky Deckhand, really the star of the show, just stealing some early points in the game, protecting it with Annie, bouncing things back to your opponent's hand, just chipping away very, very slowly. And I think that this aggressive style perfectly complements what I believe to be the best battlefield in the game, which is the Arena's Greatest. I think that this was the star of the show in many ways, and I think there's a lot of really interesting discussions to be had to see, well, okay, how good is Arena's Greatest, right? Very often when I was watching, Alan in the top 16 managed to beat a Annie player despite him being the player going second and the opponent having Arena's Greatest. And for me, that felt like a very big moment. I think Arena's Greatest sort of solidified itself as the best battlefield in Riftbound based off this weekend.
Oh, there's no question about it, right? It's the speed at which you're able to kind of put that pressure on your opponent, especially with the way the scoring system works, right? Arena's Greatest gives you the opportunity to start at 1, score that first point, and then if you're playing an aggro style deck and you're just trying to count by 2s all the way to the finish line, right? And as soon as you're sitting on those even numbers, you're basically threatening the game as you get into those later turns. And I love what you're saying about Sneaky Deckhand, because for me, I really took away, listen, I'm a Teemo guy. I've been loving Teemo nonstop, and I play Sneaky Deckhand in Teemo. But it's not quite the same thing, because with Annie, those extra runes that you get at the end of the turn, you are able to essentially solidify that Sneaky Deckhand's position on the board, or bring it back, move it out, or if they bring something in, Guster, you have so many options as to how you kind of maintain your board presence with the Sneaky Deckhand. It's something that Teemo doesn't necessarily do. Obviously, of course, with an extra energy, you're able to kind of hide a unit, hide a card, hide your Teemo and protect that Sneaky Deckhand. But it's not quite the same with what Annie does. Annie's face-up runes are so incredibly powerful in these aggro matchups because they have answers at all stages of the game. From that first turn, they have answers for whatever you want to do to get that Sneaky Deckhand off the board. And it's one of the reasons why, as you said with Arena's Greatest, if you're playing Dazzling Aurora and you want the game to go longer, you better be prepared to you got to get rid of these cards fast, because you are putting your whole game plan on the fact that is my opponent going to just start barrel rolling me points wise before I even get my strategy off the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that Arena's Greatest is particularly good at doing is it's a battlefield that you can play when you know you're going first. Going first seems to be much better in Riftbound. The early maths suggests it could be somewhere around 55%. Chance to win when going first, 45% when going second. Those are very early and rough figures. But if you throw in a battlefield like Arena's Greatest into the mix, it's actually increasing that, potentially skewing it closer towards 60%. Just having that little bit of extra tempo is the advantage of going first, and ending the game 1 point sooner can make such a huge difference and make it very, very difficult for your opponent to catch up, as they don't have as long to catch up in tempo.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that at all. And for those that are listening, obviously Arena's Greatest does provide at the beginning phase the one additional point, which is important because it happens at the beginning phase, and we did have a player like literally in the top 8 forget to assign their beginning point, which is heartbreaking because had they done that, they very likely would have gone on. But because they didn't, we had one of the greatest TCG games I think I've ever seen. So I'm kind of happy they missed the point, despite the fact I do feel for them. But I will say as well, as someone, I mean, you guys know this, I come from the digital card game space, and we joked about it on the first one, where I tend to be a little sloppy here and there with what I'm doing on the physical board, and seeing someone make a little mistake like that, I'm like, oh, that sucks so bad. But also, I bet you I'm going to make that mistake one day.
I think everyone's probably made that mistake.
I'll be there
right?
at some point too,
Yeah, I think every player's made that mistake, and unfortunately for Alan, it happened at the worst possible moment. And there's a lot of interesting discussion to be had, because Riot had this sort of emergency balance patch just before the tournament discussing missed triggers, and they actually specifically named Arena's Greatest as a trigger which could be missed, whereas something like the Ravenbloom Student and the Thousand-Tailed Watcher, they don't have to be named until they impact the board state. I think that there's an argument to be had there that you could say, well, if you realise you missed the trigger of the Arena's Greatest and it's still your first turn, I personally think it shouldn't be too much to just rewind that and add the point. Certainly if I'm playing at locals with a friend, I would happily assign them the point. Now, I think we also have to highlight that Alan didn't even ask to be given that point. There was actually a very interesting post-game interview, and the revelation was that Alan's opponent offered, do we just assign the Arena's Greatest points and so nobody can miss it? And Alan said, no, I think we should play by the rules, which I think is very fair. And then when Alan realizes he missed his triggers, he's accepted it. That was, he wanted to play by the rules. He didn't ask for it. And I think that is a very good way to go out in terms of like representing, that's like the play of a champion. They made a mistake, but they will only blame themselves for it, and I think big credit to them. They were my favourite player to watch this weekend, and I gotta say, Alex, their build of Kaisa, which was built so quickly, also using the Arena's Greatest, is my favourite deck list for the weekend, and I think that Alan had such a good chance to win the whole thing if it wasn't for that moment knocking him out of the tournament.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things where, you feel bad, but at the same time, the fact that they took it in grace was absolutely incredible. And I do agree with you. It really shows the mark of someone who's been there before, been around competitive TCGs, understands what the expectations are. And you know what? They'll be back. It's not going to be the last time we see them in a top 16 or, kind of on camera. So I'm really happy for that. Now, with regards to other key takeaways here, I think a lot of people expected Kaisa to take the victory here. I mean, obviously the deck is incredibly well designed. It has all the tech you need to basically wipe things off the board. In theory, it has a lot of tools to deal with the aggression of something like an Annie, but at the end of the day, it didn't quite break through. We saw a top 4, which is basically Yi and Annie, and at the end of the day, the Kaisa ended up on the outside looking in. So what do you think happened with those Kaisa matches? Do you think it was just one of those situations where people knew it was going to be like 30-something% of the meta and they came prepared with the tech? Or do you think that maybe it's just not quite as top tier as people thought it was?
I think it's really fine margins at the top, right? I mean, we're talking about an Arena's Greatest trigger being missed, and I think we easily could have seen Kaisa winning the whole thing here. So I think that it really shows you how fine the margins are at the top. I think Kaisa, 2 out of 4 decks being in the top 8. At that point, it's not like Riftbound, we're suddenly playing like best of 5s. It's still a best of 3. You're still rolling the dice before the game starts as well. So there's a lot of luck potentially to be had even at this stage in the tournament. So I think that Kaisa, 2 out of the top 8, it easily could have won the whole thing. For me, the only disappointment about this top 8, Alex, is that one other deck didn't creep in. I think it's amazing to see Annie. doing so well, but it would have also been brilliant to see something like a Teemo deck sneak in there. Set, I think, a big story of the weekend, had a particularly poor performance, didn't make no set deck into the top 64, so that was a big shock as well.
Yeah, and Set has had some really good tournament performances, like even at locals and other smaller skirmishes and stuff. Like, that's a good deck. And it was kind of surprising to see that it not, really perform well at all into day two or at all. Like, it literally didn't make day two. But in terms of the top 8, we did have Kaisa. We had 4 Annies, 2 Master Yis, and 2 Kaisas, I should say. Were you surprised to see 2 Master Yis make the top?
No, I think the 2 favorites going in were Kaisa and Yi. And I think Annie also probably would have been what a lot of very top players will have told you that they had on their radar. What's really interesting about the Master Yi decks is a lot of the time when we look at Master Yi, we sort of put it into 2 categories. We say there's a Dazzling Aurora version and then there's a mid-range version. Well, both of these decks are somehow neither of those things, but also both of them at the same time. Because these 2 players have actually, using the sideboard, tried to build a version of Master Yi, which can be either Dazzling Aurora or a mid-range deck, depending on the matchup. And I think that also shows you how much these players are respecting Annie, that in the finals, we actually saw the Master Yi players sideboarding out their Dazzling Auroras for game 2 and putting in a bunch of 2-drops to try and contest Annie in the early game. So I think that Annie, having such a good performance, when something like this happens in a meta, it's not like this is just how it's going to be forever. Suddenly, the play rate of a deck like Annie will increase a lot, and then I'm sure that there's going to be some decks out there which have a really good performance into Annie. So it's going to be very exciting to see how things develop even further. A result like this just opens up, I think, even more potential to brew.
And what's interesting about it is I think that, like, during the course of this tournament, we joked about it last week about how, like, at locals and stuff, I speak to a lot of players, and it seems like they undervalued the impact of battlefields. They really did. I felt like a lot of people were focused on the decks themselves, the cards they were missing. And I mean, you could have the exact deck from the any top player, but, like, first of all, you got to think about the piloting of it, all those types of things, right? The anticipation, understanding what the meta is, what your opponent might have, counterplaying and playing around the tech that they might be kind of showing. Those are the key things that really differentiate skilled players. With the battlefields, we've talked so much about Arena's Greatest. That completely changes the scope of how these matches work. And when you go into a best of 3, where you're selecting and, like, your opponent's selecting, it goes to show you, like, how important perhaps, like, that Arena's Greatest game, like, as an any player, you kind of have to win it. Because if you don't, you're on the back foot significantly for those other games. And so if you're, let's say, a Master Yi player and they're going to be opening up with the Arena's Greatest, and you're thinking, you know what, maybe I take out my Aurora and I go more mid-range, right? Maybe I can sneak this game out, because if I sneak this game out, if I win this Arena's Greatest game, especially if I'm on the draw and they're on the play, like, that's a game that they talk about 60% win rate. That's a game they want like 80% of the time, right? But if you can flip that into your advantage somehow, then suddenly the rest of that game or the rest of that series plays out totally different. And so one of the things I really took away from the skirmishes and, of course, from Houston is just how important the strategies around the battlefields are, and just how important the sideboarding is. Like, that cannot be understated. And knowing the types of advantages you have going into games 2 and 3, knowing the types of decks your opponent's playing, what they might be sideboarding, I think is going to make the difference between people who make top cut and people who don't, because I think it really showcased how impactful these battlefields are.
Yeah, because also what you've got to consider with your sideboard, right, is how are you sideboarding to support your own battlefields. We see, like, Scrap Heap plus Zorn Warrens be a really popular combo for an Annie deck, for example. But you've also got to be thinking about what your opponent's battlefields are doing. So if you're playing against Annie as a Dazzling Aurora player, it's so important to win that game 1. Because if you don't win that game 1, Annie is going to have an opportunity later on in that series to go first with Arena's Greatest. And it's going to be so difficult to make the comeback from that. So that first game in particular against these Annie decks seems so important. And it's interesting then to see the different sideboard strategies in the 2 Kaisa decks, right? Like, George's Kaisa deck was sort of a little bit teched in the main deck for Kaisa mirrors, for example. And then in the sideboard, he had quite a lot of things that could be good against the Annie. Whereas actually what Alan did, the other top 8 player playing Kaisa, his main deck seemed to be quite teched for Annie, and then the sideboard had cards like Lecturing Yordle, which he could bring in for Kaisa mirrors. So just seeing the different strategies is so cool to see.
It is. It absolutely is. And again, it gave a lot of like flavor to the tournament. I think that the deck crafting, although some of the decks obviously had this core identity that you kind of expected from the Legends, I think that there were some surprises in the sideboard. Like, are they really running 3 smoke screens? Like, there's no way of actually knowing those things till you're in a position where we're like, wow, he just played 3 smoke screens, right? Which, again, we've talked about as being one of the most hype moments that I've seen in the TCG in the longest time. Still can't believe how that game went down, and we'll talk about more of that soon. But actually, you know what? I want to talk about it right now because I got to tell you, there was a card. We're talking about cards that really stood out to us. And if one card stood out to me, I got to tell you, Darius, okay, we know this card is good, but this is essentially an accelerate trigger, right? And you saw games be won on this. This card really impressed me. There was a couple that really stood out. Sneaky Deckhand's use, obviously, in Annie really was showcased well. Flashes showcased extremely well. But Darius, I thought, really had a strong showing at this tournament.
Yeah, it definitely did, didn't it? And one thing that a lot of the players were doing is also triggering the +2 might in their opponent's turn. Just leaving a lot of resources open. Like Alan with his triple smoke screen, that also gave his Darius +2 might. So it was a card we saw in both Kaisa and Annie decks put in a huge performance.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I just get excited about cards. I can just go off on different cards impressing me all day long. But let's actually take a second to talk about the meta, day 1 and day 2. The conversion rates between different decks might have surprised a lot of people. We did kind of poke away at that. No surprise that Kaisa and Master Yi did represent massive amounts of the meta, nearly, 50% combined. 33% on Kaisa, 15% on Master Yi. Annie came in at 11% on that first day. And I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't actually expect Annie to be that high. I knew it was kind of gaining in popularity, but I was expecting Teemo or perhaps even Seth to kind of like increase in its popularity, but it ended up being Annie. Misfortune at 5%, Teemo only 6%, Victor 4%, Yasuo. I know you get roasted for saying it right.
Apparently.
Yasuo. Okay, guys, forgive me. I'm still learning.
Allegedly.
I'm still learning. Yeah, I appreciate that. And Darius, obviously, at 2%, and you do have some others, but these were kind of the primaries. Overall, though, do you want to kind of touch on, Joe, the standouts with regards to who made it to that day 2, who made that top cut, and who didn't, and any other surprise takeaways that you have?
Yeah, so the conversion rate data isn't on screen, but I'll read some of it off. So the conversion rate simply means what percentage of players using this deck in day 1 made it through to day 2. So the highest conversion rate is actually Misfortune here. So Misfortune, a deck that's going to be played a lot with Dazzling Aurora. It was actually the top seed after Swiss, after day 1 as well. So there was 57 players playing it, 7 in the top 64, 11.86 conversion rate on that, 11.86%. So Misfortune with the best. It was then Annie, Kaisa, Master Yi. So even though Misfortune didn't make the top 8, it's easy to sort of not talk about it. We should absolutely have a lot of respect on Misfortune's name with the biggest conversion rate into the top 64. And 5th place, the 5th best converted legend in Riftbound for this weekend, Alex, was Volibear. This is really caused by something that's very fascinating, which was the prizing structure that Riot gave for this event, where the best performing player for each legend would get a unique, currently unique 1 of 1 sort of foil metal prize card of the legend that you can actually use in tournament play. And Alex, I've been hearing rumors of players rejecting over $15,000 offers for these cards. I've heard, in fact, people are talking about the $50,000 number in reference to these prize cards. So while the prizing of the main event and finishing is brilliant, actually it seems like the best value that you could have had in this tournament, the best expected value, the best chance, would have been to have played Garen. Because Garen was the least represented leader at this event. 13 players, Alex. And we saw in round 1 of the stream on day 1, a Garen player just putting Garen into a Dazzling Aurora shell. The Garen didn't do much, but if you could beat those other 12 Garen players, you will get this Garen prize card, which the market value seemingly is tens of thousands of dollars. And this just created such a diverse meta. It created such an amazing show. And actually, I would imagine as time goes on, we're going to see an even more diverse meta because of this. Like, I think that people that played Kaisa and maybe scrubbed out are going to be sat there thinking, why didn't I try a Jinx deck? Why didn't I try Volley Bear? We saw Lee Sin and Volley Bear in the top 64. It was quite extraordinary. So huge credit to Riot for this prizing. It's actually something Star Wars Unlimited have done, Alex, where I've played in Star Wars Unlimited events where the best performing player, if you hit the top 64, you get a showcase of your leader. And the Luke Skywalker and the Darth Vader cards, at that time, that was the only way you could get those showcases. So it was really sought after by some players. And I have a feeling someone at Riot has seen that and thought, I like that, let's roll with it, but let's not limit it to just 2. And let's not just give them a showcase, let's give them a unique version of this card, which is going to make our players really enjoy their experience at our event. And I think it is like setting the groundwork for something truly special.
There's a couple things that are so important. First of all, I think that in card games and in all games, aspirational content is so key. The idea that someone could be like, yeah, like I like going to locals, I like playing with my friends, I like the collection side as well, right? Those are really key things that are to enjoy about a TCG. But the idea that you can be like, you know what? I'm gonna do my homework. I'm gonna grind, I'm gonna practice, I'm gonna try to cook, and I'm going to try and win something that is genuinely unique of value, right? Those metal cards are remarkable. But not just that. You're right. This was the first major regional for North America, and there's now a chance that people are going to be like, you know what? Yeah. Do I want to kind of get mixed up in the 30% Kaisa race? Or am I going to try to cook some Lux and see if I can win that metal card? And here's the crazy thing that might happen. What if somebody stumbles across the cook for Lux? What if Lux makes top 16? What if Lux makes top 8? And that person had no intention of actually winning the tournament. They just were going after the prize. But then again, they're like, you know what? I actually got something special here. I think it encourages people to take a shot at legends that might not necessarily being the meta or being in play. But like, this is something I've seen in almost every single game I've ever covered, where people get really dialed in on the meta. They go to all the sites, they see the videos, they see the hype, and that stuff's cool too. But like, the premium top version of any given deck just might not be uncovered yet. You know what I mean? Maybe someone out there has the secret key to a Garen or a Lux or whatever happens to be. And this type of prizing structure encourages people to cook and at least try. Thankfully, with new sets coming out on a frequent basis, those types of legends do get support. There's no question about that. But it is a really cool structure that does encourage at least a little bit of cooking for people who might not actually think they're going to win the whole thing, but rather want to have a positive experience and do aspire to get something.
Yeah, I think that it's just brilliant. It was great for the broadcast to watch, great for the players, great for the overall meta, and great for the game. So I think it's one of the best things about this weekend.
Absolutely. Now, we're going to do we did the top 8 breakdown. We talked about the prizing. We talked about our key takeaways. I think it's about time we actually talk about some of these decks. Joe, we're going to go to the deck screen here, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to go through here. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the number 1 Annie? I think that's what most people are going to want to talk about. And then we'll talk about some of the other standout decks available from the top 8. But we do have on screen the number 1 Annie. Joe, if you'd like, would you like to read out the primary list so that our audio listeners can get a glimpse as to what this deck has?
Yeah, so it's going to be 6 red runes, 6 purple, so a nice even split. Annie, Darkchild as the legend, which is at the end of your turn, ready 2 runes. This has a ton of synergy with the spell cards, of course, in the deck. Cards like Ride the Wind, which can move a friendly unit. Flash, which can move 2 of your units to the base. Fight or Flight, Rebuke, all costing 2 or less. So a ton of synergy here with Annie and just really feeding your tempo, right? Instead of having 2 runes on your first turn, you could potentially have 4 in a sense. The battlefields, Zorn Warrens, that's going to be the game 1 battlefield, combining it with the Scrap Heaps and the Traveling Merchants. Not only are you getting potentially extra card draw and more consistency, but you're also just adding more cards to your trash for Vi. And Vi, Ride the Wind, seeming to be one of the biggest powerhouse combos in the game. A lot of the talk was about Mundo and Ride the Wind, Alex, but it seems to be Vi with this sort of significantly more aggressive shell, really putting in the work. The Dreaming Tree is the battlefield to go second, and the Arena's Greatest, of course, to go first. And what you have here is just a very low to the floor deck. Lots of control, lots of combat tricks, and then cards like Kaisa and Darius as the top end, which can come in ready potentially.
Yeah, the deck itself has so much aggro potential. And the thing I really like about it is exactly what we said with Vi. I mean, you're in a situation where if you can score some of those early points, right? You score those early points with the deck hands, you protect the deck hands, and then all of a sudden you might be at 6 points relatively early on, and you're able to use that Vi with Ride the Wind to kind of clean up those locations. It is truly remarkable what she does, because unlike Mundo can kind of maintain his power a little more consistently turn after turn. You're giving up 3 into the deck, but as you play cards, he kind of gains that power back a little bit. But with Vi, I think there's first of all, I think the card's brilliantly designed. Kudos to the design team for coming up with such a cool design, because there are also situations where you're like, okay, yeah, I got 8 in my trash. I probably only need 3 for Vi here. Maybe I give her a 4th just as a little safety net for a Stupefy or something like that. I love that type of decision making, and I like the idea that you kind of have to utilize her to maximum effectiveness using stuff like Ride the Wind. What I found really fascinating, Joe, and I would like your take on, is Flash versus something like Fight or Flight. Because for me, Flash is obviously increasing drastically in cost. It is only available in the Proving Grounds, which I'm going to guess is an even hotter commodity today than it was yesterday. And as a result, I do think that Fight or Flight and Flash, they do occupy very similar spaces. Obviously, Flash being able to move 2 cards. Fight or Flight has some interesting utility that is slightly different, obviously being a hidden synergized card. But I would appreciate if you could maybe, let us in on okay, why would people run Flash over Fight or Flight? When is the time that you would want to pick one or the other? Or are you totally satisfied with actually running a bit of both, or perhaps sideboarding 3 copies of each and kind of choosing which particular matchups you choose Flash versus Fight or Flight?
Yeah, I was really surprised looking at these deck lists, actually 3 copies of Flash and 2 copies of Fight or Flight. Because in my own playtesting, I've been evaluating Fight or Flight a lot higher. So let me explain why I was wrong. The reason I thought Fight or Flight was the better card is because it's got a bit more flexibility and utility, in the sense that you can use it offensively to move your opponent's cards back to their base and also use it on your own. Whereas Flash, okay, you can do it on 2 of your units, but you can't use it on your opponent's. I think the key difference, and probably something I've been underestimating, is the difference between the reaction speed that Flash has and the action speed that Fight or Flight has. So Flash being able to save your sneaky deckhand, for example, against something like a Hextech Ray against Kaisa is extremely valuable. When you're playing Annie, you play that sneaky deckhand down, you've got 2 runes available, and actually it's not going to be that easy to stop a Hextech Ray, for example. But with reactions like Flash, you suddenly have more coverage. And I think that's probably the deciding factor. It's worth mentioning the deck list that won here that we're looking at, 2 copies of Fight or Flight in the main deck and 1 in the sideboard. Remember, those 3 copies of Scrap Heap are going to be sideboarded out every time going into game 2 and 3. So it's very likely they were playing 3 Fight or Flights most of the time anyway. But those cards are just both excellent. And it's another card really, Alex, which I think surprised me in how great it was this weekend, was the Rebukes. So Rebuke is return a unit at a battlefield to its owner's hand. It's a 2 energy but also 2 power cost card. And I think that against Master Yi in particular, imagine your opponent finds Dazzling Aurora and they hit like a big Dead Bloom Predator, and you just need to score that battlefield 1 time and you can win the game. But that 8 might is so difficult to get over. Well, that's where cards like Fight or Flight or Rebuke can just give you so much value. Okay, if they defy 1, well, maybe you've got another one to help you out. So these combat tricks just closing the game, so valuable for the Annie deck. And also the use of the sideboard, so interesting. Draven as well, by the way, Alex, sort of like another big mighty unit that's probably going to be good against Kaisa. Draven is my might is increased by your points. Very expensive at 5 energy, 1 power, but Kaisa can struggle to deal with these big units sometimes, and I think that's why it's in the sideboard.
And when you're playing Arena's Greatest, he loves it, right? It's basically free real estate. He's starting at that 2 power already, and it helps you close out those games. And you're right, Kaisa does have difficulty removing those larger bodies. The smaller bodies, sure. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why you run the Pouty Poro, because it has that deflect. And so therefore, if they're going to be committing to removing it, they're going to pay an even heavier cost, which helps you to kind of conserve that board state. Which makes me wonder if the meta starts to shift away from Kaisa, even in Spirit Forge or whatever, which you and I got to spend some time breaking down in future episodes, of course. I wonder if Pouty Poro starts to see less play, right? Because it's, if the matchups change and stuff like that. But this deck here really stood out to me as being remarkably well designed, but also leaning into a lot of the key tricks and major cards that like we have identified as being excellent. Like, your stacked deck just being absolutely fantastic. Early on, using cleaves to get advantageous trades. Gust being used very effectively to save and also to essentially disrupt your opponent's plays. What I also noticed, and what you obviously would have noticed as well, is things like Scrap Heap coming in and out of that sideboard, depending on whether or not the Warrens were in play as the primary battlefield. And I think that having a set game plan around when you're going to be playing specific cards, when each battlefield is going to be utilized, I think is key if you want to be successful competitively, because knowing that there's going to be times where, Scrap Heap's coming out if you got that the Warrens out already, and then maybe that's where you bring in the Rebukes, or you finish off, that play set of Fight or Flight, or bring in, your Seeker. At the end of the day, I like the flexibility that this deck provides. It does not surprise me that this ultimately ended up winning, because it has everything. It has all the combat tricks it needs. It also has the exact battlefields that really push this archetype to that next level, while also counterplaying a lot of these slower style archetypes, like the Aurora style decks that want to extend the games further. So my major takeaway here is I was surprised that Flash was being utilized as often as it was this particular weekend. But honestly, this deck is so unbelievably well-rounded. It would not surprise me to see it nonstop at locals going forward.
Yeah, the last thing I want to touch on, Alex, as well, is how much I underestimated Annie Stubborn, that's the chosen champion in this one. She's quite expensive at 4 energy, 1 power for just 3 might, and she returns a spell card from your trash to your hand. But the flexibility that this card gives you, right? Suddenly, you could discard a Ride the Wind in the early game or play a Fight or Flight early on, and maybe if you just need that particular card to win the game, Annie's just chilling there in your champion zone, you can just wait and wait and wait. And actually, it doesn't matter if she's expensive if you're about to win the game anyway. And I think that's also why we saw Rebuke prove to be so good. Yes, the 2 power cost is very expensive, but who cares about recycling runes, Alex, if you win the game that turn? You don't need those runes for the next turn. You already won. So cards with expensive power costs that can close out the game are proving to be very strong in Riftbound.
All right, Joe, next up is Master Yi. This deck, obviously, we talked about it before. There are very different options, whether or not you want to sideboard specific type of cards in and out. The Master Yi decks that ended up performing very well in the top 16 were the ones that had a degree of flexibility that perhaps was a little unexpected. One shout out I want to make to this Master Yi deck right off the bat is I feel like they were teched ready to see not only the Kaisas, but specifically other Master Yi players. When you see a card like Sabotage in a deck, not only do you get a lot of information from Sabotage, but when you're against a mirror match, Master Yi, and you have the Sabotage and they don't, and you just pop off their Dazzling Aurora, you punt it into Oblivion, that's a pretty bad feeling for them, pretty good feeling for you. And so I really like the design of this particular shell. Very, very top heavy, but it was ultimately susceptible to the aggression of Annie. And so, Joe, why don't you break us down the second place Master Yi?
Yeah, so Dazzling Aurora, of course, undoubtedly one of the best cards in the game, especially when you look at Deadbloom Predator as well. I think Deadbloom Predator's overtaken Time Warp, Alex, as the most expensive card in Riftbound right now on the secondary markets. So it's obviously not a cheap deck to play, and both of those cards are in the orange domain. So the question is, what do you pair it with? Well, there's Volley Bear, which is a natural one, but players haven't really enjoyed that too much. Misfortune, of course, had a great performance this weekend. In Misfortune, you get access to some really good top-end purple cards like Stack Deck for consistency. So what do you actually get in a green deck? Well, you get the Master Yi Legend, which is like reasonably good in this deck. But I think the key thing here is the copy of Find Your Center and Zonya's Hourglass. So Find Your Center is a 3-cost spell, which is draw 1 card and channel 1 rune exhausted. So this deck is all about ramping. It has 3 copies of Mobilize, a 2 energy spell, which is channel 1 rune exhausted. It's an orange card. And the other orange card is the Catalyst, which costs 4, where you channel 2 runes exhausted. So by playing green, a big reason to do so is your deck gets a lot more consistent because you have this additional way of ramping in the form of Find Your Center. And then Zhonya's Hourglasses is this 2-cost gear, which is the next time one of your units would be killed, kill this instead and recall that unit to base. So if you imagine you finally get to Dazzling Aurora and you have a Zhonya's Hourglass set up, you play a Deadbloom Predator to your opponent's battlefield, your Deadbloom Predator dies, but it like takes a bunch of your opponent's Annie's cards with it, like a Vi and whatever else it might be. Even if it doesn't survive, the Zhonya's Hourglass I think it is going to protect it somewhat and move it back to base and you can stay in the game. So it's a fascinating deck, but that sideboard is heavy on 2 costs. 3 Stalwart Poros and 3 Clockwork Keepers. And in the very final match of the tournament, we saw them sideboarding out Dazzling Aurora to put in these 2-drops and just try and play this mid-range approach. So it's a fascinating idea, trying to sort of do both things at once, like be your Dazzling Aurora deck for most of the time, but then use all your sideboard to try and compete with these quicker decks. It didn't end up working out for them. It was a 2-0 in the final, but of course it worked out for them very well for the rest of the tournament.
Yeah, the deck has a lot of very interesting aggro tools and defensive tools as well. Obviously, you have your Defies and your Wind Walls, which will allow you to give you like some defensive posturing to protect your board state or get you to that end game. But like things like Charm, they really stand out to me because they can force these confrontations, these showdowns that are going to be so advantageous to you once you start getting these big bodies on the ground. And so ultimately this deck, while being clearly a ramping slower deck, once it starts to move, suddenly becomes the most aggro-centric deck you could ask for. And as a result, it doesn't surprise me it did as well as it did. Now, with regards to the kind of the top end here, when you're looking at like the Tasty Fey Folk, right? What are your thoughts around that particular card and how it could be utilized, not just in the Annie matchups, but some of the more aggro-centric matchups as well?
Yeah, we also saw Tasty Fey Folk being one of the top end options in the Lee Sin deck that made the top 64. So that was also a deck that played Deadbloom Predator, Tasty Fey Folk. I don't believe it played Dazzling Aurora, but Tasty Fey Folk, a nice top end option. Doesn't cost any power to play if you just want to play it down, but it also has that flexibility of the Accelerate. But this is a really nice card because when it's killed, you do channel 2 runes and draw a card. So it replaces itself, you get more runes. A lot of the time when you play a card in Riftbound that's powerful, it's actually going to cost you runes because you have to pay power costs. Tasty Fey Folk is doing the opposite, right? Like even if you accelerate it in, you pay 1 power cost to do so. When it dies, you get 2 runes back. So it's very efficient. The only reason we don't see more of it is because it costs a lot. 7 energy is a lot, but that's why it's perfect in a deck that plays Mobilize and Catalyst and of course Find Your Center as well.
So at the end of the day, with regards to Master Yi, I think this tournament did show ultimately that the mid-range variations are not in favor compared to these top-end Aurora style lists that are really trying to get to that end game. It wouldn't appear that, while they are kind of using some mid-game sideboarding here and there, ultimately looks like the Aurora versions have kind of ruled the day.
Yeah, I think so, Alex. But if anything, for me, the winner of this sort of debate on the Master Yi deck is actually this sort of approach where you try and do both. And the other Yi deck that made the top 8 had a very similar approach. But rather than having Dazzling Aurora in the main deck, it was sort of a mid-range deck that had the Dazzling Aurora in the sideboard. So you see one deck that's being a Dazzling Aurora deck first, and then sideboarding in some cheaper cards if necessary. And then the other deck, which is being a mid-range deck, but then sideboards in the Dazzling Aurora. I think that might be the approach that I would probably try. Put those Auroras on the sideboard, bring them in for mirrors, but just be well protected against Annie. Because, look, you look at this deck and you can see it's strong, but the glaring weakness of a deck like this is cards like Sneaky Deckhand, right? Arena's Greatest. And I think that is very much the meta that we're going into. And it's no surprise to see Annie performing so well when decks like this have been dominating the meta previously.
I mean, people that have been playing TCGs for a long time, aggro red, I should come to no surprise to anybody whatsoever. Now, we do have the other top four Annie list as well, relatively similar. Was there any differences or any kind of things that you wanted to point out with this particular deck?
Yeah, I think when you see this deck, you can sort of see a couple of the things that were missing from the winning list. Falling Star, one copy of this on the sideboard. There was no copies in the winning deck, which is quite interesting. And also this Noxus Hopeful, 2 copies of that on the sideboard, which weren't at all in the winning deck. So, of course, when you're looking at deck lists, it's often you're talking about what cards are in there, but very often with deck building, the hardest thing is actually deciding which cards not to include. And I think that is one thing that Riftbound is doing brilliantly well. Despite being the first set, right now is the smallest the card pool will ever be in Riftbound. But even now, players are struggling to optimize their lists, and there's so much reward in every single card that you can put in your deck in this game, and I think that just adds to the skill ceiling. So I'm so excited for the future of this game.
Yeah, and preparing for Summoner Skirmish, like I felt that exact thing because I was rebuilding my Teemo deck over and over and over again. I mean, I was committed to the seals and I was trying to figure out what I wanted the deck to look like. And it was crazy just how hard, even in the first set it was, to come to that final list. Like even with the sideboard, I was like, I don't know if I want to sideboard these. I think they need to be in the list. And then I made changes. I'm thinking to myself, okay, hold on. These can't be in the deck at all. Then I cut them. Then I brought them back. Like the decision making is so incredibly kind of difficult. Now, one thing that really stands out in this particular deck, and I don't have an answer for it, so I'm going to pitch it to you, Joe. See if you have an answer for it. We got a single Legion Red Guard, and like you don't often see just single one-ofs of. I mean, you might see a single Time Warp. That kind of makes sense, but a Legion Red Guard as a single kind of surprised me, and I'm wondering if you see something here. Like obviously, it has that that kind of accelerate, but I'm kind of curious as to what you see there and why a one-of a Legion Red Guard of all things might make a deck like this.
Yeah, we also saw George in the top 8 on Kaisa also play one of these. I think they had 1 Pouty Poro, 1 Legion Rear Guard. I got to say, I prefer the Pouty Poro. I think that the deflect of the Pouty Poro is pulling its weight quite some, forcing Kaisa players to pay that extra recycle cost, stopping them getting to Acarthian Rain 1 turn sooner. Like Acarthian Rain and Falling Star are kind of this deck's worst nightmares. So I personally love the Pouty Poro, and I think it's performed exceptionally well. The Rearguard is a very interesting card though to have as a one-off. Like it's kind of like your 4th copy of Sneaky Deckhand in a sense, right? Like that just way of just getting some cheap non-committal points in the early game. And I think that's really the reason it's in the deck as a one-off. I would actually imagine it gets sideboarded out quite often. Because I was listening to you speak, Alex, about how difficult it is to build the deck before the tournament. And I think what's lovely about the sideboard is those tough decisions don't end when you submit your deck. Because in between every game 1 and game 2 of every series you play, you're having to ask the same questions. What cards do I leave on my sideboard? What do I bring into the main deck? So I just love all of the questions that the game is throwing at you all the time. There's just so many decisions to be made, which just increases the skill ceiling so much.
And with regards to the Master Yi deck we talked about before, while comparing these two different shells, we just compared the other Annie. Now we have the Master Yi. This one is more on the mid-range side. Did you want to kind of bring us through what you see here?
Yeah, so this is the mid-range approach that has the Dazzling Auroras on the sideboard. So it's trying to be both decks at once. And I actually prefer the approach here where you start as a mid-range deck, but you can add the Auroras. Because as I mentioned, I really believe that game 1 against Annie is the most important. And actually, I think that game 1 when you're playing some sort of Dazzling Aurora deck is the most important. Right? Imagine you play your Dazzling Aurora if I'm playing against you, Alex. If I go into game 2, I'm probably going to expect that you have some gear removal that you've added into your deck, for example, right? Or maybe you've got the Arena's Greatest to double down on going first. So for the Dazzling Aurora players, the game 1 seems to be the most important. If you lose that, you're going to be struggling quite a bit. They can tech in all the cards necessary. And this approach where you don't even play Dazzling Aurora in game 1, they're not going to put in gear removal if they don't see the Aurora and they suspect that you don't play it. Like as soon as I see Pit Rookies, Poros, Clockwork Keeper, I say, oh, okay, they're not playing Dazzling Aurora. I don't need any of my gear removal or anything like this. And suddenly game 2, you can just catch them off guard. So I think that this deck has a good chance of beating Annie when compared with the other version that just has Aurora. But I just love both approaches, right? And even we've got these two kinds of Yi decks, one Dazzling Aurora, one without. And even now when we're looking at this sort of hybrid approach, there's still two different ways to do it. Do you start with Aurora in the main deck, or do you start with it in the sideboard? But I think either way, based off this event, the Master Yi decks which are trying to do both things at once seem to be the way that the deck is going. It's quite rare in a card game to have a color combination have multiple decks within it. Like usually when everything's said and done, like something gets refined to like a perfect list. And I think with Master Yi, there's a lot of room still to experiment with this sort of approach where you play Dazzling Aurora in the sideboard.
And the final deck we'll talk about today is the highest performing rank 5 Kaisa deck. Now, obviously, Kaisa coming in as the general favorite, running over 33% of the meta. Ultimately did really well. And as you kind of mentioned prior, perhaps a little bit of an error might have cost them the ultimate crown, or at least the opportunity to get to that ultimate crown. But curious about what you think about this Kaisa list, and if you think that Kaisa has any additional room to not just evolve over time, but maybe get refined to a better state. Because it already seems near incredible, right? And is there more height for Kaisa to reach?
Yeah, the two Kaisa players in the top 8, Alan, former Runeterra world champion, and then George, who went all the way over to China and became the Chinese regional champion. So George's Kaisa deck was a little bit slower. Like they're very similar. If you look at the 48 cards across the main deck and the sideboard, they're very similar. But Alan's approach here is to have cards like the Yordle, the Acarthian Rain in the sideboard. There's no copy of Acarthian Rain in the main deck here. So Alan is very much teched to try and beat Annie in game 1. Triple smoke screen we saw be absolutely brilliant. Cards like Noxus Hopeful and Poro. So this is like an aggressive version of Kaisa, which is looking to go toe-to-toe with Annie. And in mirror matchups and against the Dazzling Aurora decks, it's trying to sort of go under them. It's trying to be the most aggro version of Kaisa possible. I think that's the way of looking at this. And I think the battlefields highlight that as well. The Arena's Greatest, proving itself to be the best battlefield of the weekend, although of course this is the Arena's Greatest that the trigger was missed on, which potentially cost Alan the whole thing. And then the Reaver's Row is likely going to be the battlefield you use when going second, which is just a really nice way of scoring some cheap points as well. Kaisa can remove the board and control the board. It can struggle sometimes to score points, but this one's playing 9 2-drops with the Pouty Poro, the Student, and the Watchful Sentry is extremely consistent on finding a turn 1. And then there's also 4 copies of Noxus Hopeful. So Alan on turn 2 is going to be looking to play a 2-drop and a Noxus Hopeful to go very wide, and then just control the board with these things like Cleaves and Hextech Rays and Void Seekers. I think it's a brilliant list. If I was going to play Kaisa, I would absolutely be taking this one to deal with the onslaught of Annies.
And with the spells being so inexpensive, obviously Darius benefits from that because you're able to kind of, ready him very quickly, utilize him to a solid advantage. And what we saw often during the tournament was the Hextech Ray. And I think that one of the reasons why you saw a lot of players who were running sneaky deckhands were running Flash was because of the reaction speed, because you're able to take that sneaky deckhand out, avoid being knocked out by that Hextech Ray, and then ultimately be able to kind of reposition yourself in the next stage or the next round to score vital points to then get your snowball going to end with the V, ride the win, or whatever you have to do, right? So really like this deck as well, and it would not surprise me if this ends up being one of the ones that you see very consistently being turned to for Kaisa. Now, Kaisa had already been refined quite a bit. One thing I want to mention here is we did see sometimes, on some occasions, Time Warp being used to high effectiveness. There are 2 Time Warps in this deck. What are your thoughts around a single Time Warp versus 2 Time Warps? Because obviously it's a very large committal, but like any kind of, retake your turn style effect in any card game, this has the potential to single-handedly win a game. So I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts as kind of running it as a singleton versus running it as a pair.
Yeah, in a deck like Kaisa, there's no way of like discarding it from your hand either, right? If you're playing Time Warp, perhaps in a Teemo deck, you might be able to discard it, whether you play Zorn Warrens or whether you play Traveling Merchant. So I think playing 2 copies in your main deck is pretty risky, right? If you end up with 2 of those in your hand, you're losing out on a lot of real estate, but it's definitely a card which you can tech in for some matchups. I think, Alex, the funniest thing that I realized this weekend about Time Warp is a good card in normal situations, but I discovered it is the best card in the overtime of Riftbound. So if the judge comes over, time on the round, that's up, you go to your 5 turns. So if you're finishing your turn, Alex, and we're playing time is called, you'd be turn 0. Then when it's my turn, turn 1, you'd be turn 2, I'd be turn 3. Then you'd be turn 4, and I'd have my final turn 5. So imagine if it's your turn 4 in overtime, I'm getting ready for my last turn. Whoever has the higher points when it's the end of the 5th turn will win. So I'm getting ready for my 5th and final turn. And you play Time Warp, you would have the 5th turn and I wouldn't get another turn. And that is confirmed in the rules. So Time Warp, insanely broken card in overtime. And I will be very, very fascinated when we see that happen for the first time, because I feel like it's going to happen at some point. On stream maybe as well. It would be unbelievable.
For sure, for sure. And that is going to take us to the conclusion of this second edition of the Into the Rift podcast, guys. Thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate the response to the first one. Joe, was absolutely insane. It was really, really heartwarming to see you guys come out, support us with the numbers, the likes, the loves, a ton of shares, a ton of subscribers right off the rip here. It was kind of crazy. I mean, both of us, we've been creating content for so long, and to launch a brand new channel with 0 subscribers and just out of the blue too, like neither of us really said anything. We're kind of like, hey, here's the first episode, like, enjoy. And to get the response we did really, truly meant a lot to us. The way you can help is if you know a friend playing Riftbound, share the podcast with them.
Yeah, I'm super excited. And big events like this, there's more on the horizon. Bologna's happening in February, 1 week after Spirit Forge's release. It's going to be amazing. And then, of course, there's big events planned in America and more for Europe. So super excited. I want to try and compete at one of these as well, Alex. I'm itching. I want to try and get myself a prize Jinx card.
Yeah, buddy, I would love it. If I can get a prize Timo card, I would love that so much. But yeah, I'm going to have to set my sights on Las Vegas, I think. Despite the fact I know a little bit of Italian. It is pretty far from Toronto, Canada. So I might have to set my sights on Las Vegas. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. And we'll see you on that next one.